jobs. You keep hearing nobody wants to work anymore because you see these jobs that aren't filled, but they're not filled because there are fewer people of working age are being born. Birth rates are going down. The population is graying. You get more people like me. For a while, we were very restrictive with immigration, right? Under President Trump. And that that restricted the pool of available workers. So that was the real issue. There weren't enough workers. But immediately people started moralizing about it. Oh, the problem is people's work ethic. And I find that fascinating because based on my research, I don't think that's the issue at all. People may not want to work any particular job that only pays minimum wage and is dirty or dangerous or has weird hours or something. They may want to work at a better job, but that doesn't mean they don't want to work at all.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to This Anthro Life. I'm excited to have you all here today. I'm Adam Gamwell, your host, as always, and I'm really excited to talk with Claudia Strauss today because, on the one hand, we know that our nature and ideas around work are changing, right? What does work mean to folks today? And that we have the rise of remote working. We've had a pandemic that has brought the rise of remote working and changing that. And then there's lots of contingent labor, gig work, things like that. So, do I have a 9 to 5? Do I have a 40-hour work week? All these things are kind of changing of what work might mean to us. But the funny thing is that the narratives or the kind of national myths that we have around what work means are changing much more slowly. And I think that's something that is interesting that we can kind of dive into to get a sense with. But I'm really excited. Claudia Strauss, you are an anthropologist, so always a good talk with a fellow anthropologist and a prof over at Fitzroy College. And you have I think a really exciting and important new book out that's called What Work Means Beyond the Puritan Work Ethic. And besides being a nerd that, I like this idea of the Puritan work ethic to think about with Max Weber. I love how your work helps us explode and think about that. So we're going to dive into all those things. But first, I want to say, Claudia, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to another anthropologist.
Right. And it always feels kind of dangerous, doesn't it?
I think we are a dangerous profession.
Yeah. I know. We need t-shirts that say that, I think, So one of the things, we're kind of saying up top, Claudia, is that your research dives into, I think importantly, how Americans perceive their jobs, right? And perceive work for themselves. And you did a lot of really, really interesting research talking with folks who are also kind of out of work or long-term unemployed, kind of figuring out that process for themselves. And I thought that was a really compelling way to frame your conversation. So I'd love to kind of kick off with getting a sense of why start there. Why did you find yourself talking with folks that are unemployed or kind of in this long-term unemployment moment, trying to figure themselves and their work out?
Well, it was a moment following the Great Recession when a lot of people were unemployed and unemployed for a long time. Not that they wanted to be. They were looking for work. I was practically everybody I was talking to, I found because they were looking for work. But this was a time, and it's a very different labor market than now. So you have to cast your mind back 10 years or more to a time when the unemployment rate in Southern California, where I did my research, was over 10%, when there were 3 job seekers for every job opening, which is opposite now. Now there's less than 1 person looking for a job for every job opening. So it was a very different moment. That's why I was talking to people who are out of work, because there were a lot of them. And the thing is, when you're out of work and for a long time out of work, but you want to work, it makes you unusually reflective about what work means. So it was a really good time to catch people, both because I had a little time and because they were thinking a lot about what their jobs meant to them and what they wanted in the next job and what they would do differently maybe with their lives.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important point to both remember, like, if we're getting a sense of like where we are in history, but then also reflecting on what that means for us today. Because I think that is a really interesting and important distinction to think about. One, that if we're seeing, which almost feels crazy to think about, right? That there's 3 folks for every 1 job that might be out there. And now we're kind of seeing an opposite problem, right? That there's more work than workers. And it's interesting because in between both of those, right, we might still see narratives from employers or even folks themselves looking for work around we might think of it as a moral imperative, right? That either nobody wants to work anymore today, which is really funny to look at research of that and see that people have been saying that since like 1850, like literally in newspapers, no one wants to work anymore. It depends on what the work is though, right? which I think we can dig into. But then on the other side too, that there's more like I want to work, but I can't, right? But there might be still a perception that, oh, these people don't want to work, right? From employers or from folks. And so like what's happening there? Like there is this kind of weird moral tug narrative happening of that one should be working but can't, or doesn't want to but should be. Like what's happening here in the American psyche about like what should we be doing around work?
Yeah, and I think that rapid shift, it's taking people a while to realize what's going on. So yes, you keep hearing nobody wants to work anymore because you see these jobs that aren't filled, but they're not filled because there are fewer people of working age are being born. Birth rates are going down.
Mm.
The population is graying. You get more people like me, baby boomers.
I'm great too. You just can't tell.
For a while, we were very restrictive with immigration, right? Under President Trump. And that that restricted the pool of available workers. So that was the real issue. There weren't enough workers. But immediately people started moralizing about it. Oh, the problem is people's work ethic. And I find that fascinating because based on my research, I don't think that's the issue at all. People may not want to work any particular job that only pays minimum wage and is dirty or dangerous or has weird hours or something. They may want to work at a better job, but that doesn't mean they don't want to work at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's such an important point too, because you kind of, I think, said a key idea there too in terms of like what is the one's work ethic, right? Like what do I want to do with my time and what kind of work do I want to do? But I think you also importantly point out that there is, when we kind of gloss over in that narrative, that we miss this idea that it's like not that I don't want to work, I just don't want to work this kind of job or that type of labor, for multiple reasons, which and that matters, because it isn't just I do or do not want to work. And this gets into, we can kind of put our theory hats on for a second too. And because I think this is helpful to think about, we have these ideas of kind of laborist and post-laborist or productivist kind of frameworks of like what we should be doing for work. And I found this elucidating, like to kind of help make sense of why we're seeing this disjuncture and like kind of discomfort of talking about this. So can you tell me a little bit about this in terms of like the laborist and post-laborist perspectives, and how is that shaping our discourse around
Oh,
work?
I'm really happy to talk about it. I find this really fascinating because when I think you said putting our theory hats on, I think social theorists and also activists, political activists, even on the left, we often think of left-right differences, but these are differences among progressives on the left. There are two very different ways of thinking about work and organizing, political organizing around it. The classic, in classic Marxism, workers are central. You've got a heroic working person, and that's, and the idea is we want a full employment economy. So it's organizing to make sure that everybody who is able to work can work and at a good wage. But the push there is towards full employment. I think one thing that's Dr. Martin Luther King, his famous March on Washington was a march for jobs and free. He very much believed in this, that what we want is for everybody to have good employment. But there's this other approach on the left, a post-work approach, where the idea is work is only enriching the owners of capital. Our labor is only enriching the owners of capital. Why is there this social imperative to do that? Couldn't we figure out a different kind of economy where people are still engaged in wage labor, but much less of it? And so it becomes very interesting when you think about the future of work. Now, I don't know whether all the predictions of high levels of technological unemployment are going to come true. And I'd be curious to know from the other guests you've talked to what your thinking is about that. So I'm not making any predictions whatsoever, but people speculate, right? But what's interesting is from these two perspectives, if you start worrying about being displaced by the robots, the laborists, the ones who believe in the dignity of work, the importance of work, the centrality of it, that your social benefits, anything you get from society, should be dependent on either working or not currently being able to work, maybe back to work in the future. when they think about a future of robots taking jobs, the idea is we can't let that happen. We need to make work a central part of a good life. Wage work. When we're talking work here, we always mean wage work, right? Lots of things we can do that require effort, but we're talking wage work. Whereas the post-work theorists, the post-work organizers are saying, bring on the robots. This is great. This is the kind of future we want. As long as, obviously, people have to live. But, then they would say, well, the government's got to figure, there'll be massive political revolt in our hands if the government doesn't somehow keep people alive. So those are two very different approaches. Now, I have to say, the way I talked about it might make me sound like I'm on the post-work side. The people I talk to, I'm actually kind of in between. Yeah. I think, and this is something we can talk about. I'm not all work should be the most important thing you're doing and taking up your whole life. The people I talked to didn't want that. But I'm not. Work has no intrinsic value. People don't want to be doing it. And if they could get them, and if they had some other way to make a living, they wouldn't. No, the people I talked to, most of them wanted to go back to work and even talked about enjoying work, having fun at work.
I thought that was one of the most interesting parts also about your research finding too, is around this idea of enjoyment and fun. Because on the one hand, I think it is very helpful to have these two framings in terms of when we see both employees, wage workers, people, and then also business owners talking about what the labor market needs to be. And if I'm looking for work, or if I need to find more employees, what that is like. It's important for us to understand where they're coming from, as we like as anthropologists, be able to not say that they're going to be specifically this one thing. To your point, they're going to be either laborist or post-laborist, but they can be a blend. But those do help us get a sense in terms of someone's kind of potentially background, mental context, right? Their mental models of why I should be looking for the kind of work that I'm doing, or why I should be working this way, or, why my employees need to be thinking about work a certain way. And this is why I think this is such an important conversation, because it helps us both get a sense of, the kind of employee side, but then also the often implicit employer side too, right? When we said the thing above in terms of nobody wants to work anymore, right? This is an anxiety often from the employer side, wanting to make sure that people will be able to fill positions. But I think, as you rightly point out there too, that we have to be able to kind of move between these positions, and why ethnography I think is really helpful is it shows us that oftentimes people will have these much more gray perspectives. It's not this, it's very easy to say it's a polarized this or that, right? It's laborist or it's post-laborist, but most of us don't live in either a theory or a perspective that's just one box or the other one. And also, let's think about that in terms of the kind of in between there too, because I share that perspective in terms of that, there is this desire around being able to do something in the world, right? And for a lot of people, they attach that to work. It doesn't have to be that though. And I think a lot of your interlocutors kind of pointed that out. So we can share some stories around that, I think. And then I'll put a pin or bracket the future of work piece till a little bit later, because we can definitely talk through that too. I think that's a really interesting piece as well, because a lot of this, a lot of business managers and business folks are they want to say, what is the future of work, right? And I have talked to a bunch of folks about that on the show. We can kind of think through there. But the important point about that too is for the pin for that later, is that a lot of these people I've talked with are business owners. And so we can think about that in terms of what perspective they're going to bring around technology and what work can be. But we'll come back to this. So for now, it's this idea, the kind of in-betweenness that you saw talking with folks, right? This that work isn't everything, but it means a lot to me, and it means different things to different folks, right? And maybe enjoyment is a way to kind of get us in there, because it's interesting that we don't see fun as a term that comes up a lot in terms of, tell me about your work. It's fun. Have I described jobs like that? I don't know. And so I think that gives us a really interesting window into different attitudes that folks have. So what's happening there? Fun stood out for you. And why? Just because it was something that we don't usually hear? What was it? What was it about kind of funness that caught your attention?
It just came up over and over again. This was such a surprise. This is why I love doing anthropological research of the sort that I do, where I talk to people. We could talk about my methods, but it's an approach where I'm just talking to people, and people say things you don't expect. So, for example, I was talking to an administrative assistant. We used to say secretary, okay? And she was currently in a situation where she was just taking temporary jobs, looking for a full-time job. But she was talking about some of her past temp jobs that she had. And she talked about one where she was working for a company or school district where they had to take information for one kind of file and put it into an Excel spreadsheet. And she said, wow, that was so interesting. It was so much fun. And I said, okay, fun? Work? Wow. And then, when I asked her, what does work mean to you? She said, I could get lost creating a PowerPoint. I could get lost formatting a document. I could get lost figuring out an Excel spreadsheet. That's just fun for me. I mean, it would just come up. Now, she wasn't the only one. I have a list in my book. I have, I think at least I forget the figures. I have to go back and check. It was like a third or a quarter of my interviewees used fun in connection with their work. Nothing I was expecting. It just came up. Now, I have to say, this is a very American way of talking, and not even all Americans will do that. I think it fits in with a sort of very positive thinking, optimistic, sort of chipper. And it's, But the thing is, one thing, they were not being sarcastic, because sometimes people use fun sarcastically. Oh, that was fun. No. They were, I'm only counting cases where they were sincerely found it fun. Now, what's interesting is what kinds of things that they find fun. And I kind of broke it down into 3 kinds of things that they found fun. The most important really was relationships with other people. It was relationships with other, with your coworkers, with your boss. I had one woman who was an assistant in an accounting firm. And she, what was interesting in these polarized times is this young woman is Republican and her bosses were Democrats, but they would just joke about the differences between them and their politics. So they would just sort of joke and tease. I had another woman, again, an executive assistant, who just talked about how she would like to check in with her coworkers and ask how her coworker's daughter did in that swim meet. And she said, this is how we're being human. Just the kind of, it does, you don't have to have a best friend at work, but making relationships like that. The tasks themselves are really important. So do you enjoy the tasks? What are you spending your time doing? Is it interesting? And some people like the administrative assistant who liked wrangling Excel spreadsheets. For her, it was that kind of intellectual task. For others, a young man I talked to was doing, building, race courses for extreme sports. And he said, when I build a mud wall that's 8 feet high and so many feet long, that's just fun. It's so satisfying to see that at the end of the day. So some people really enjoyed the tasks. And then the physical attributes of the workplace are really important too. Are just the temperature, the lighting, how the furniture's, does it look pleasant? Is it, feel pleasant? Does it smell pleasant? One man talked about working in a warehouse for a candy company, and he loved coming in to the smell of chocolate.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah, but anyway, so all these things could make work really enjoyable. Now, that doesn't mean it was, they were passionate about what they were doing. It didn't mean, they wanted to spend all their time doing it. And this is the other thing I want to talk about. Can I talk about the nature of the work ethic that tends to go with this?
Yeah. That sounds good.
Because the people who talked about work ethic, what was really interesting is that there were some people I talked to who felt they had a calling to be doing what they were doing. And they would use words like calling or passion. It wasn't, it was a small number, but there was a certain number, somebody who is a teacher, a special ed teacher. Her sister had special needs, and she felt a real calling to be doing that kind of work. It could be all different kinds of things. They were less likely to use the word fun. They enjoyed it, but it was sort of a deeper kind of enjoyment and meaning. The people who are more likely to talk about fun, like a woman who was a retail associate at a dress shop. Their work wasn't central in their identity, their sense of purpose in life. It was much lighter. And they had what I call a diligent 9 to 5 work ethic. And this is something I really want to say to people. You say some of the people who listen to this podcast are business owners. This is one of my most important points that I really want to make to business owners, which is we tend to think of the good employee as the one who is passionate about their job and is going to willingly spend long hours at that job. You know, you could call them up in the middle of the night, send them emails, whenever. They're just totally into it. This is all that matters to them. That woman I talked to who found so much fun from wrangling Excel spreadsheets, she also said, when 5 o'clock comes, I want to go home. That's it. I enjoy going to work, but when the day's over, I want to go home. And she said, no, work is not central to my identity. I asked everybody. So there's this in-between category that we overlook of people who want to do a good job. They really take pride. They would say, when I asked, is work central to your identity? A lot of people I talk to would say, well, no, I wouldn't say that. I'm a good worker. I always do a good job, but no, this isn't the most important thing in my life. My family's more important to me, or my religion is more important to me. God is more important to me, or something else is more important to me. That was the majority of the people I talked to. They're good workers. They'll do a great job, but they want to protect their non-work time too. This isn't all they care about.
I think that's an important point. And I found that section really fascinating too, that there's this discrepancy or this kind of, challenge between the idea of what an employer might look for in terms of, I'm passionate about the job. And this, when I was thinking about this too, this got me thinking of the challenge oftentimes in both the job application process and the interview process, right? You kind of have to, I'm just going to say, feign or lie about how excited you are about a job. And not because there is the actual, on the one hand, we might say, for me, one of the reasons you're getting the job is because there's a remuneration. You're getting paid for your time, but there's a material benefit, but then also that there's also just this, employers want to hear about the intangible, like, oh, I'm really excited about like this kind of work, or I'm very passionate about blah, 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 that's a really interesting kind of piece. Cause it's like, I think to your point of like how we can see that the idea or the norm of like passionate workers like filters into then what employers are expecting from like an application process. And it's like interesting that what if we thought about this in terms of what if we provide a good working environment so that passion can grow for somebody's job, right? Or if you find enjoyment in working on Excel sheets, or it's like something I found recently for myself. It's, I'm an anthropologist also, but it's like I've been working a lot in computer tech stuff for a few years now. And it's like, and I found that I really like nerding out over coding. I'm not great at it, but it's like, I like to be able to solve a very specific or try to solve a very specific problem. Right. And that's, fun. It's kind of maddening, but like, that's not something that I would have ever said before. Like, oh, I also really would want to go work on coding. But like, that's something that I wouldn't have known if I wasn't tinkering with something, other kinds of work, and I will say also, yes, as folks may know too, but I'm self-employed and I run my own business. And that's an important part of like, we can talk about, that's also, contingent labor and that thing. So we can dive with there too, but like, cause I don't have an employer that's saying, hey, are you really passionate about this work? I mean, I guess I'm my own boss, so I can be mean to myself, I guess,
right.
But that's an important point, to realize that at the same time though, I also want to say like, I don't always stop working at 5, but I still feel like I need to stop around 5, and I want to, because I want to go play with my kid and my family and like do other things. Right. And so it's like interesting that like across categories, right, there's a lot of this, there's more in betweenness than we kind of give credit for. So I agree. And I think that's a really important point that we do want to hammer home to business owners and folks that are also just, if they're hiring managers too, thinking about like, we do like passionate workers. Like that is an important part of finding folks that really want to do good work. But a lot of this too is recognizing that there's much more diversity in terms of how we might approach what work could mean to us. And like, just because I may not say or come out saying I'm super passionate about this job right now, or part of it, or that I want to be done at 5, that I'm somehow not a good worker, right? Or that I'm or that someone else that's like obsessed is going to be better, right? Because I do think like what's been nice, the correlate on the other side is that we are seeing increasing conversations, and I think in large part thanks to Gen Z, about mental health and about wellness in the workplace and like burnout, right? And millennials, the meme "I can't even," right, is just this like it's just too much right now. Like we've been asked to do family and work and life and blah blah blah, and like other generations make fun of us, but like there's this interesting part to kind of think through what can this be, and like how do we think about wellness and well-being as part of that process. And you know, something else that you wrote about too is that we had seen that interesting rise, in terms of like fun at work. Like there's the organic kind of fun, right? That, I might get from working a spreadsheet, but then there's this other kind of like, I guess, inorganic, right? That, startups are like famous for this, for like putting ping pong tables and lunch every day. And like, those are nice, but then also you think about it, that's kind of like a gilded cage, right? You're never that far from your desk at that point. So I guess, how did you see folks kind of talking about this, or, what kind of takeaways you have around this idea of like, we need to be able to put passion in its own space, and let it kind of be. Sometimes it's for the work, sometimes it's for the specific task, sometimes it's for my family, right? And they can all work and be a good worker, but then putting that in conversation with this idea of well-being and wellness, right? And that, and how can fun and wellness play together, right? And how do you see folks kind of talking about these two arenas?
Yeah, people talked about it a lot, and I thought that was really interesting, and that is saying something about this moment, the importance of wellness, and not just Gen Z. I mean, I was seeing this from middle-aged people I talked to, too. And it was really interesting how wellness played into their thinking about work, because they would say things like, they would see working on a regular basis as part of what's needed to stay well. They would say things like, it's like a car. If it just sits out there, it'll rust. Or they'll say, I looked at my father, and when he lost his job at the steel mill and couldn't get anything else, then I think that's where he started going downhill. So people would say that they'd see regular work and a good job. It's not just working at anything, depending what the job is. Because some jobs wear you down, they leave you less well off.
Yeah.
But the right kind of job they saw as part of the good life, but they also saw, again, that balance as important for wellness. They saw so one man I talked to, again, was a supply chain strategist for a cosmetic company. Loved the tasks, found it intellectually really interesting, great variety. So he would sound very enthusiastic when he was talking about the content of what he was doing. But when he talked about his hours, he said, they expect me to work 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, and then I've got to commute. He had an hour commute in each direction on top of a 12-hour day, and 10 or 12-hour day. And he said, it just made me bitter. It just took out all the joy of what he intrinsically liked the job, but those long hours, that didn't leave them any time to de-stress, to pursue anything else that was important to him. So there was definitely this discourse around wellness. Again, you have the work can be part of that, but not to an excess.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because that like makes me think about I have not read Mary Wolfenstein, but you mentioned her later on, and this idea of like fun morality, which I thought was a really interesting and kind of creepy idea, but this like, curious American notion that like we're obligated to have fun, both at elsewhere, but also at work. Right. And I think that filters into kind of how you're talking about, we have this like chipperness, right, that we think about in the American worker. And like, that was an interesting piece to put in there for multiple reasons, but like two that came to mind was one, that it sounds like fun and pleasure are things that don't jive well with this, we haven't talked about yet, but we will now, like the Puritan work ethic, right? This idea that like a lot of this is based on like seriousness, and like there's a higher calling to your work, right? And that's why we do what we do. And this is why we talk about a calling as one of the highest forms of work in typical like, work theory. And I think that filters into a lot of, again, how people think about work, whether they like consciously say, yes, this is what I should be doing. But then like, but in this case, like Wolfenstein says, and you're pointing out too, is that it's like fun morality is not about this idea that like, oh, we're doing the opposite of like this serious kind of calling of work, but it's actually like not evolved, but just like an adapted form of like this still kind of puritanical way that we should be working. And there's a challenge and the problem with that too, right? That you point out that I want to break down, because it's like, this interesting idea that there's a diffuseness to that pleasure, right? This is why it's okay. It's not like a super intense moment of pleasure, but that like it's spread out across work tasks and days. And so I don't know, this struck me as a really interesting and curious piece to think with in terms of like, we do talk about the rise of need for fun and things like that, but there's these kind of interesting challenge points that like, you know, are we actually helping ourselves get out of the box and really think about what it means to say like, let's have fun or have work. And I think that's what your work does a good job of, is helping us break down both the diversity of what like small pleasures at work can be, but then also recognizing that like when an employer says we're going to have a picnic together or we're going to have a fun event, and like this kind of mandated fun or the kind of fun morality is this really tricky thing, because I don't know about you, but I've definitely had those things where like, you know, if you're working with someone or a client or you have a boss and like, they're like, hey, we're going to have our, you know, annual meeting, or like, let's all get together and have an icebreaker. And you're like, oh man, you know, it feels so forced, right?
Yeah. And if it's after hours, it might cut into your free time.
Oh, yes.
Although people, I mean, I know some young people, you know, who've said, some of my students have said things like, well, if I have to take a job in a new city, I want the kind of job where people are getting together after work, because that's how I'll meet people.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's totally fine. So yes, people are different. But, you know, among my interviewees, being forced to attend, you know, social events after hours could be a real imposition. And, you know, one of the women I talked to lost her job because she had a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. She wanted to be home with them, but she was in HR and she was expected to attend these HR events after hours, and she didn't want to do it. So
That's it.
yeah. So that kind of mandated fun. Yeah. No, one person I talked to liked it, but most people did not like it. And when they talked about fun at work, that's not what they were talking about. Was things that organically arose just from the nature of the tasks, pleasant social interactions with coworkers, the nature of the workplace. But I also wanted to get into this. You brought up this idea that I've seen occupational psychologists will talk about the highest approach being seeing your work as a calling. I really take issue with that because I think there's sort of a built-in value judgment there, which we have to help just try and understand other people's values. We're trying not to impose our own. And the value judgment I see being opposed here is you have to feel you're doing good with your work. You have to feel it's deeply meaningful. You have to feel it's making you a better person and making the world a better person. And yes, the people I talked to did feel that they were doing that, and sometimes in very unexpected ways, you know. But there was this other category we don't recognize. We sort of we culturally recognize seeing your work as a calling or as a passion. And we recognize the opposite extreme of work is work. It's just a job. You know, we also recognize, you know, get a good job, you know, that'll pay well and so forth. We recognize all those paths. Well, we don't recognize, again, there's another one of these in-between categories that I call the good enough occupation. And there's another journalist who's discovered the same thing with his interviews. But yeah, this idea, I don't want just any occupation. I want something that'll not run contrary to my values. I want something that'll be interesting, but it doesn't have to be something that's necessarily making the whole world a better place. Maybe I just, you know, I'm doing a good job there to help this organization achieve its goals. I enjoy it. Again, you know, there's this kind of in-between category that's not recognized. It doesn't have to be a calling to give you a very satisfying thing to do with your life and way to make money.
And that runs, you know, somewhat contrary to every single, like, you know, commencement speech we hear at college, right? Which is funny because it's like, on the one hand, we want to be inspired to do things in life. And that's, you know, one of the great roles of universities, I think. But then it's an interesting point that, like, but most of us, you know, don't go either know what our calling is or ever. And like most of us, I think, anybody after 40 is like, you know what, I always talked about that idea, but now it's like, yeah, but I think I've ultimately just found a good enough job and I'm actually totally fine with that, you know, and it's great. Because I can either leave when I get home, or I found unexpected pleasure in the kind of work that I'm doing, or whatever it is. It's like, it's this funny idea that we have, like, we sort of tell one myth at earlier points in our lives, and then like as we learn more, I guess, or like kind of see more, then we kind of change some of that narrative. And obviously, it doesn't have to be only linear, but I thought this was a really, really compelling idea too. That a lot of the work that people find in is ultimately, like, on one hand, like as anthropologists we know too, it's like people just make do with what they can in the circumstances that they're given. Like, and it's not just that we I know we make them, we have agency too, but it's just like when there's societal constraints or agentive constraints in terms of what we can do, and structures kind of shaping things, then we often will do what we can to make the best in those scenarios. And like, on the one hand, the good enough occupation kind of helps us point to that idea. And it also busts this, I agree, this value judgment that like the calling is really what you want to go for. And it's like, yes, I think passion is a nice thing to have in our lives, and many of us can find it, but it's like more that we're kind of also sold the narrative that should be around your work, right? Like this should be a kind of thing that you should be doing. And it's like, maybe, but when a lot of us either can't do that, and or that's not what we're necessarily looking for. It's like, it's interesting because like, again, this tension of like, what am I passionate about? What's like getting the intensity of my time and my want to do in the world, versus like both helping me either get by or like kind of find work. Also you spoke to like something else that some of your interlocutors were talking about in terms of this idea of like the attitude around wanting to move up in one's career too. Like that sometimes it can be about like, I either love the challenge of kind of like working on a big project and getting to kind of move up there, like having this kind of ambition to do more. But sometimes it was also just this of like, hey, I'm just actually happy to help my firm do better, right? Or helping improve my colleague's day or something. And like, I also kind of felt an echo here too. I know we've been teasing like the Protestant work ethic idea, but like I felt an echo in this idea too of like an asceticism of like not wanting to like want too much, right? Like you don't want to be overly ambitious, because then also is kind of like points towards a sinful idea, I suppose. Which is interesting as well, that, I don't think people kind of came out and said that specifically, but like this idea of like, what's the right way to think about like, what do I enjoy? How do I want to move up in a company? What does that mean for ambition? Does it mean too much, too little? Am I doing everything right? So like a lot of this, like there's just like this, I don't know, I'm just like this ambient sponge of like, this like work ethic that is pervading a lot of the narrative, that both people just break because of how they're actually living their lives, but then it's like still there, and like this interesting like kind of substrate. But I think also, so I guess let's say a little bit about, I keep talking about it. So like, let's say a little bit about like, what is this like Puritan work ethic, which I know I think you correctly changed the term of it and not call it that. It like, this has been pervasive. And I do want to bucket this by saying that one thing we've been doing so far in our conversation, which is important, is like pointing out also the specificities of people's things they're doing at work, right? And so a lot of this can be like again a big theory, like this from Max Weber we'll talk about, is work in the abstract, right? And so we are talking about a little bit about that, but like also a lot of what we're saying here so far, and you point out in the book too, is that like specificity matters, right? Like context is going to make a huge difference of like what kind of work matters and when, and what am I doing in the specific tasks, and like what's going to make something fun. Makes a huge difference, right? So I'll just bucket, and we're going to zoom up and zoom back down, right? And so we've been kind of in the specificity, and so this is a bigger kind of theory to help us think about what's been shaping the broader narrative, right? And so this is things we've been saying about asceticism and pleasure and fun, and like that make us rethink, passion and calling. These pieces are fitting into this, like they're kind of speaking from this broader bucket of the work at the Puritan work ethic. But I'll stop talking and what's happening here,
Well, maybe it would help at this point to explain what did Weber mean by the Puritan work ethic, and then we can kind of go from there. Does that sound sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds great.
So first of all, what Weber was really interested in was kind of a modern, what he saw is a real shift that happened with modernity in Europe. A shift away from just working to live, to living to work. And he sees this as decisive and not a good thing. Okay. He was a real critic of this. His theory, and it's controversial, not everybody believes him, was that it happened with two steps. There were two steps in the development of Protestantism. The first was Luther's idea that you can be virtuous in the eyes of God, not just by becoming a priest or a nun, devoting yourself to a religious vocation, but by doing whatever your worldly tasks are and doing them well. So just doing your work well is what makes you a good person in God's eyes. That was one shift. But then he saw the real shift for Weber came with a development with Calvin. Calvinism is, Puritanism is a form of Calvinism, where the Puritans were worried about, am I going to be saved? There's no way for sure to know that I'm going to be saved. But if I'm very successful in my projects, it must be a sign that God has found favor with me and I will be saved. And there was also this idea you have to labor constantly for God in this world. You can rest all you want after you die. Okay, in the next life. Okay. So it was an approach to time. Spend all your time working in a constant anxiety. Am I successful enough? Am I good enough? And it kind of led to this work becoming central to people's identity and purpose and meaning. And then he said the religious part of it dropped out. He said it dropped out very quickly, already by the 1700s. That was not so important. But that centrality of work, just living to work, even if you had enough money to meet your needs, it wasn't about making the money to live well, because as you said, there was this ascetic element to it. You weren't, it was opposed to conspicuous consumption. You weren't doing it for the money. You're just doing it out of this irrational desire to be highly successful, keep working, because work means so much to you. And because you feel guilty if you're not being productive. I see productivity and central here. And so I like to call it a productivist work ethic. Protestant makes you think, oh, this only applies to Protestants.
Right.
And even Weber is saying, no, the religious element's dropping out. This doesn't just apply to Protestants. So I'd rather say a productivist work ethic. Now, so Weber was writing at the beginning of the 20th century. All right. And he already felt at that point that consumerism had become much more important, that industrial capitalism was so well established. It didn't care what motivated people. They had to kind of go along with the system. So that's what Weber's saying. And there's a lot of truth to those 2 points. What I think he misses, though, is he misses a couple things. He still sees the centrality of this living to work ethic, but he's focusing just on your entrepreneurs, your people who are into the hustle culture. Not that. That's not what they called it at the beginning of the 20th century. But
1920s hustle culture,
right.
yeah.
But there were entrepreneurs then.
Yes, yep.
Those are the types that fascinated him, the types who just kept pouring their time into their business. Well, they earned the profits from the business. Of course they poured the time into the business. What about the people who work for them? They have they're not, earning something from the profits, right? Okay. They're in a different position. And Weber doesn't spend enough time thinking about ordinary workers, the sort of people I talk to, and their attitude about it. And so you kind of come out of this thinking, well, the only way to think about it is, and he said it was particularly prevalent in the United States. He's German. Okay. So he's looking over at the United States and saying, what's with these weird Americans, it was
legit question.
So, because he traveled to the U.S. and he said, this is so strange. These businessmen who just think of nothing except business. But yeah, there were these ordinary workers who have lots of other things to think about. So that was one problem with what he talked about. The other problem is he still focuses on this very grim, this very moralistic attitude. And yes, there definitely is a moralistic attitude. And I did find that even people who had what I call the diligent 9-to-5 work ethic, they felt one should be a productive worker. They did see a morality in that. They did look down on people they thought were lazy. Absolutely. But again, that's separate from seeing work as everything, making it central to your identity, wanting to work all the time. No. That's a different thing. And then this whole fun element, the hedonic element of pleasure. boy, that doesn't enter into Vapor's description at all. And
Yeah.
I'm finding it both with the people I did talk to some people who live to work. And you hinted at this a little bit. Some of them took real pleasure in meeting challenging goals. It wasn't just, I need to do this. I'm irrationally driven, pathologically driven to do it. It was fun for them to meet a challenging goal. They really enjoyed it. And then there were also the people I talked to who didn't live to work, who wanted to leave at 5:00, but took fun, as I said, in they could really enjoy the tasks or enjoy their coworkers. That whole fun element's totally missing from Vapor.
Like that'd be an odd third subtitle of his book, right? Rid of capitalism and the joy of fun, or
Yeah, the pleasure really kept coming up a lot in my interviews.
Which I think is fascinating, right? And I think it's an important point because, like, part of the interesting piece in terms of like both the framing of your work too is like what, in on one hand, like why was Weber helpful to like think about, like, because I agree, like we need to push back on his framework, but like why was it helpful for you in organizing this thinking, right? And like did you go into the interviews having a Weberian kind of viewpoint, or like, I know obviously we already have some problems with it, but like or did it kind of come up as like, oh, this is an interesting foil to what people are talking about with their actual experiences around work?
Oh, that's so interesting. I mean, I did ask everybody, would you say that work is central to your identity? So that was there and just baked into my research as something I don't think I had an expectation about what they would say. I had already, this isn't the first project I've done around work. So my dissertation research, which was back in the 80s, I talked to factory workers, and I found something very similar, that many of these factory workers had been offered promotions into management and turned them down because they knew that once they were in management, their time was not their own. They could be called at any hour to come into this. It was a chemical factory, come in, fix some problem, and they wanted to be home. So I had already seen in the 1980s that there was this other way of thinking about it. So yes, I was primed to kind of push back the framework that all Americans, are live to work and are workaholics and don't care about anything else.
It's funny too how we've also seen, right, the lionization of like the workaholic as an idea, which is funny because no one's like, yay, alcoholics, right? Which is where it comes from. But it's this funny idea that like there's a fetishization almost of what labor is and can be, and I think something else that I think could be really helpful to think about too, like both for our anthropological conversation, but I think also again to think with folks working in business that are trying to figure out both what anthropology can do, but then also what this specific conversation around work can do, and what your book can help them think about is like even your methodology too actually is really, I think, fruitful because you take kind of a cognitive psychological approach. In your psychological anthropological approach, and like what that means typically, right, is that you're beginning with an individual, you're talking with individuals, and I mean, a broader cultural anthropology will talk individuals too, but like it'll then build a kind of team group perspective, right? And so there's an interesting distinction there of like why we're talking to individuals, and then premising on them rather than saying here's the broad story of what this like group is doing. And so I'm kind of curious from your perspective, like how that. You feel like that helped your perspective of what you're looking at and getting a sense of what does work mean, especially because, coming away from this, like we're seeing that there's just a ton more gray area of what work means to people. And like, this is important for how employers think about what jobs can be, like how they're talking to employees and what they're expecting both of employees and of themselves. So tell me a bit about this and like how your approach in your methodology, like helped elucidate things in ways for you and like what you might do. I don't know if you do it again, like what might else it look like,
Yeah.
Would you change anything?
Oh, well, okay. Let me think about that.
That's a separate question.
Okay, I'll think about that. It's really interesting to think about. Suppose you were just starting with a blank slate here and you were saying, I want to understand the meaning of work in American culture right now. I'm going to ask you, Adam, suppose you're an anthropologist and you wanted to design a project. What is the meaning of work in American culture right now? How would you go about doing that?
It's a great question. This is a good test. I think one, I would want to see how people have talked about it before, and that could either be literature or interviews that we can see. Then I would just 100% want to talk with people about their work lives, right? And like what work means to them. So that's why the title of your book is also good, because it's basically just, I need to see on the ground, how are people making sense of work? And then how can we connect that to broader trends that we're seeing, whether it's like labor statistics or demographics or things like that? Or like, so what other kind of salient issues come up for folks that are shaping how they tell their stories?
Okay, so your first thought was sort of the same as mine. Hey, I want to go out and talk to people. Now, not everybody would go there. Some people would say American culture. Okay, well, what are some important documents or statements, or who are thought leaders here? What are the thought leaders say? What do we see in popular culture? What's reflected there? What do we see in religious documents? Or, they'll kind of look at public culture. And so, it could be popular culture. It could be, politicians. You could look at the discourse of politicians around work, and you would see a lot of statements about the, we're a people who believe in working for what we have, right? And being self-sufficient, being self-reliant, right? So therefore, let's cut any welfare entitlements and, right, so you could examine what politicians say. And all that makes sense. That's all part of culture too, right? Becomes really interesting, right? If you look at the popular culture, my gosh, right? It gets very complicated, because are you looking at, the serious dramas set in hospitals? Or are you looking at The Office, the sitcoms set in dysfunctional offices, right? Right. You get all these mixed messages. But for me, as a psychological anthropologist, our approach is called person-centered. We're interested in, okay, yes, all of these messages are out there, and they're very diverse. You got your relatives talking about how they hate their jobs, or other relatives talking about how they love their jobs. So you got these different depictions in pop culture. You got thought leaders saying, be ambitious. Thought leaders who are saying, be content. Right? So for me as a psychological anthropologist, I'm really interested, okay, what are people taking from all of that? And what really becomes meaningful for them? And of course, it's different for different people. And part of the method is, who do you talk to? You want to understand something about American culture. My God, it's a very diverse society. And it used to be that people would say, well, the core of American culture is the white middle class. So I'm going to talk to white middle class people. Well, then you're circularly defining what it is by what this one group thinks, which itself is diverse. But I deliberately wanted to include lots of different occupations, different class levels, both hourly workers and salary workers, people who were immigrants. All of the immigrants have been here at least 10 years, but immigrants, as well as people who were born here, men and women. So different perspectives. This is all part of America. This is who we are now. And then you talk to people and you hear these unexpected things like, wow, that job, they would say, that job dealing with spreadsheets was so much fun. I go, wow, really? Wow. Okay.
Does it make, when we hear, things like, quiet quitting, right? When that term came up about a year ago or something, a year and a half, like that to me felt like a manufactured term, and that's like, I'm trying to think about like, how can we reconcile things like that? So I would say that comes through public culture, right? I mean, I think it comes through media and because, journalists are talking with folks too, and like, do we, it's a cool idea to think about how did like things like that, like filter into kind of everyday people's conversations, or not. Right. And then like, is it important to, or do we need to like tease those apart and like say that, if we do or do not see people talking about quiet quitting, like that either means it isn't important to most people's lives and that it's actually this manufactured work term, or it's just like, what is it doing? So it's kind of like one of these things of like, how do we also account for either our own biases, what we think we're supposed to see, right, when we're doing research, and if we do or don't see it, like, and the fun's a good example of like, I wasn't expecting to see fun, but turns out it's actually diffuse in a lot of different places in really curious ways. So this is, I mean, something, and I get asked a lot too, of like, how do we think about our biases as researchers to both make sure that we can have our research be sound, but then also recognize if we're not seeing something, which I think is also important, how do we account for that? If someone asks us like, hey, well, you didn't see that, does that tell us something?
Yeah, well, and, what would I change? I'd love to do my research again now. was doing it 10 years ago, so.
Right on.
So, would anything be different now? I don't know. I mean, I know that in terms of, I've had some interviewers kind of hint, well, maybe it's because you're talking to such a diverse group that you're seeing people not making work the center of their life. But I actually compared the numbers of people who were born in this country and people who were immigrants to see how many said work is central to, well, how many live to work. It was under 20% for both. And it was slightly higher for those born in this country. But interestingly, a lot of those born in this country who were, and not actually, there were also some immigrants who lived to work. A lot of those who had, before their period of unemployment, lived to work during that long period where they were looking for another job, realized, wow, my life was really out of balance. This was not good, not healthy. They would, again, go back to that wellness discourse, that health discourse. This was not a healthy life. So it was under 20% for both. And also, this research I did in the 1980s, these were white male factory workers, and they did not live to work. So now quiet quitting is something else. Quiet quitting is, okay, you're there in body, not in mind. You're just there for the paycheck. You're just putting in the 9 to 5. You don't care about the job. I think this reflects a real anxiety. I mean, I think there are two things. Is there some anxiety on the part of employers that this is what we might be seeing? And I wonder to what extent it's because you don't recognize another type beyond the one who lives to work and wants to stay at 9 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock or whenever. You don't recognize this diligent 9 to 5 as somebody who is a really valuable employee who could find fun in the job, love the job, but just doesn't want to be, disturbed after working hours. There also, I have a real problem with the Gallup workplace engagement survey, which is sometimes used to back this up, because their only categories are engaged, and disengaged. And then you got this group in the middle. And the people to be engaged, you have to, it's really about your attitude. It's more about the workplace. Are they constantly giving you positive feedback for your recognition, for what you've achieved, so kind of recognition for what you've achieved? Do all your colleagues want to do their best at their work? Well, what if you can't say yes? I can't say, well, my colleagues really seem to want to do their best. And then you come off as less engaged because, you can't apply all these superlatives to your workplace. They're the half of all the people they talk to are in the middle group. They're actively disengaged. That's a minority. And they may not be in the top group that they call engaged, but they could have called very engaged, or they could have labeled great workplace. Workplace just kind of in the middle, in an okay workplace where they probably feel, okay, they're not disengaged. But that gets used as evidence of, we've got this epidemic of quiet quitting. Well,
yeah, that feels so inadequate.
Yeah. So I think it's a real methodological problem, and I applaud Gallup for wanting to improve workplaces. I don't like the way it's being used as alleged evidence of disengagement.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, and it makes me think of even as we're talking about like economic indicators and like national health, right? We have like the gross domestic product, which is a super aggregate number, right? But it's like compared to other countries that might be higher in the US, but then you look at like the happiness index, gross happiness index in the US is like 57th or something, or it's like one of the lowest. And it's like, or in terms of wellness index and wellness scores, right? That the US is one of the only industrialized nation that doesn't have like, healthcare and childcare and education for young kids, and it's like these interesting, like when we're talking about what are our markers of success, right? It says something when like when we use like, we need to be able to put in the same box, like economic indicators that we say matter. And then also like workplace engagement as the thing we're using as the measurement, right? As the metric, because it does make a difference, right? In terms of both the narrative that we're telling, but then if we're blind to the kinds of metrics that we're using, like, we're only going to see what we're measuring. And then if we're only measuring one thing, that's all we're going to be able, see. And like, but recognizing the value judgments that we might put on engagement. And it is interesting to kind of realize that the top tier is engagement. It's like, it goes downhill from there. That's kind of scary. Right. Versus like the super engaged employee, versus the okay engaged, But even that idea too, like engagement is an interesting thing to think about. Like I'm disengaged. Okay. Does that mean the quality of my work is bad? Maybe, maybe not. But it might be great work, but disengaged because I don't want to like go to, the after work function kind of thing. And it's like that interesting piece, that gets me, it has me thinking about this idea too, that you mentioned this at the end, when you think about like both future work, but how we could like talk about like, we need to be smarter, and at least more conscious of like what metrics we're using to measure, workplace wellness, engagement, economic growth. And then also what that might mean for things like future work and how is AI going to take jobs, to come back to our laborist and post-laborist ideas that we talked about up top. And you quoted technology journalist Kevin Roos that I think put this really well. That was just like, we need to be not talking so much about like AI taking jobs, but like what's AI's effects on the quality of jobs going to be? And I think that's 100% right. Like, not just because we're qualitative social scientists, but like quality matters versus quantity in this case too. It's like, how many jobs there are, it does matter. But if all the jobs are terrible, then that's different than saying that there's like either a ton of jobs, but they have great quality, right? Or there's a fewer of them that have great quality. And so it's like, I think that's a fundamentally important piece that we need to think about for how we set up workplaces, right? And like, what is the quality of the kind of work that we're doing? And again, this is not do you have ping pong tables? And it's also not just like, are we removing drudgery? Because like, again, what drudgery is for some people is different than others, right? Building a 9-foot wall doesn't sound very fun to me, but like the one dude loved it, and so it's like, that's great. And like, that matters. And so that's not drudgery for one person's drudgery is another person's like treasure, right? Like to mix metaphors there, and it's like, that matters because that means that there's actually space for all kinds of work, right? And all kinds of tasks within work and people to be well in workplaces beyond these like broad narratives of like, oh, AI is going to help us get rid of like repetitive tasks, like, moving, I don't know, data from a piece of paper to a spreadsheet. Some people might really actually love that work because it for them is mindless. They can listen to the radio or they can do something else with it. Like it doesn't, we shouldn't kind of prejudge the kinds of work that work and jobs might ask, So, I think that's important because as tell these like bigger AI narratives, like we tend to miss these specificities that like, and that your work, I think, does a good job of showing us that there's such a big diversity of what can matter to people in their workplace. Like if we can learn to ask and think towards that when like working with employees and working with other people in organizations, like that can be a huge boon for like building a much better, and healthier workplace because we're like finding what are your strengths, what's enjoyable to you, and let's build around that versus, come do this thing and we're going to get rid of the stuff that we think is boring, even though you might like it.
Right. I do want to say there are some things, some aspects, some jobs that nobody liked. Okay. So I don't want this. Yeah. I don't want the takeaway message to be, hey, no matter how bad a job might seem to me, there'll be somebody out there who'll like it. Because there are some things that nobody liked. Okay. So for example, the young man who was a lumper in a warehouse where he was kind of pulling this cart loaded with stuff. It kept bumping into the back of his ankle, and that's why they're called lumpers. They would develop this huge welt. They were Achilles tendon. And it was noisy. The employees didn't enjoy being there. They shouted at each other. They, had none of those qualities that makes work fun. It was not intrinsically interesting. The not good social relationships, terrible workplace. Yeah. So another thing that was very harmful for a number of my interviewees was harassment of various kinds. It could be around sexual orientation. One of my interviewees was a gay Black man who was harassed around his sexual orientation. And that just ate away at him. Or he'd be in racist harassment. Those things just kind of ate away at him. A immigrant who really worked very, very hard and was put down by others in her work group. She had a nervous breakdown. So yeah, there's certain things that are bottom line that every job has to have. It's not like there's some horrible job out there that somebody's just perfect for, Yeah.
No, totally. Yeah. And I agree with you there too. And like, I think the examples you just shared there too, like point out the importance of also having, a healthy, constructive work environment also, right? Because it's like your colleagues and your boss can make a good job terrible.
Yeah.
And that matters too, right? So it's like, it is one of those, I guess that's actually the other side to think about this too. It's that like technology won't solve people and people don't need to be solved. like we have to treat ourselves and each other like humans also as part of this as we figure this thing out, and so that's the thing that can, like, numbers and technology can obfuscate for people, is they forget that there's people behind it, right? And that's the entire thesis. We know the work of Mary Gray's ghost work is that, like, all the technology that seems super shiny in AI and running it by itself is actually run by a ton of underpaid people, often in other countries, like, that are doing the work that people here don't want to do. Looking at, like, images that might be offensive, so they don't show up on Facebook, and things like that. And so it's like it's one of those, like, in tech terms, like, human in the loop is what they might say with AI. Instead of having it just run itself, it's like you're going to pop in and, like, answer a question. Most of all this technology stuff has humans in the loop. We just sometimes talk about it like it doesn't, and, like, that's actually a huge detriment also, because it ignores potentially harassing and like, bad workplace environment also, right, for folks. And so that, I agree, is a key piece. So lesson there: keep humans in the picture at all times, because we're the ones doing the work.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Claudia, I want to say thank you so much for joining me on the pod. This has been really, really great to chat with you. So before we sign off, I just want to check: is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure that we can kind of touch on? The table is still open if that is of interest.
Yeah, I mean, this is This Anthro Life, and I just wanted to throw out that what I love about anthropology is it says, the way we think now, the way we live now, this isn't the only possibility. There are other options. And that applies to work. Work is changing. I mean, you brought up the rise of freelancers, independent workers. They're now, McKinsey found in 2022 that 36% of U.S. workers are like you. They're independent.
That's a lot.
And most of those, it was their primary source of income. It wasn't just a secondary, source of income. It was the primary source of income. So the kind of thing you're doing, working for yourself, this is the wave of the future. And when we think about the future of work, we kind of have to put that together with the AI piece, the tech piece, and because they're going together, And so it's not like, I think in the future, as this becomes more and more important, it's not like you're either going to be employed or unemployed. If you're working for yourself, you can't be unemployed, right?
Yep.
Right. My clients, you might lack income, but you're not, there's nobody to fire you, right?
That's right.
It's just a very different way of thinking about work.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm curious, like, too, like, how are you thinking about that, like, as a professor, as a teacher, like, and thinking about your students and, like, helping shape their future, like, how is that approached, like, either through your classes, through your department, or, like, how do you think about that in terms of, like, what's our responsibility, I guess, as anthropologists to help the next generation of anthropologists figure out these like unstructured, uncharted pathways?
Yeah, well, what I think anthropology is good for is look, we can look at other societies. We haven't throughout history always had formal work, right? Where with,
Right.
You get a contract and you're hired, and that wasn't the main way human beings made a living, right? Right?
Yeah.
For millennia. This is a small slice of human history. And even today, most people around the world are in the informal economy. They're not in the formal economy. And so you can look at examples in other societies for what are other ways of creating a working economy that's not centered on full-time standard employment.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And it's always, it was one of my favorite things that I found early on that when I got my first job out of college, as I did anthro majors all the way, anthro nerd from bachelor's on the way up. And like, one of my early colleagues, had showed me that poster. It was like, another world is possible. And I was like, that's anthropology right there. That helps us realize that.
Absolutely.
How we can go. Cool. So super excited to chat with you today. I really appreciate you taking the time. Excited for folks to check out your book, and we'll have it linked in the show notes. And really excited. So thank you for doing the research, putting it out in the world, and excited to see what conversations we can generate from this. So thank you so much, Claudia Strauss.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, it was a real honor and pleasure.
Cheers.